Hello again, everyone, and welcome to the episode number 2 of Wrestling with Rusty. In case you saw a little bobble, I don't know how to erase the video just yet, so I've got a couple of seconds of bobble that might end up on this video. Please forgive the technical difficulty. Eventually, I'll learn how to do this correctly and do it the right way. But it's not the technical problems that matter at this point, it's the information. I hope you guys have been taking a look at the Billy Corgan version, and let me stop right there before I continue and say it is Corgan, C-O-R-G-A-N, not Corrigan, C-O-R-I-G-A-N, as I've been reading from some people online, so it's Corgan. The Billy Corgan version of the NWA, National Wrestling Alliance. I guess ROH, Ring of Honor, and New Japan Pro Wrestling are about the only two national promotions that do wrestling the way it should be as a competitive sport and old school. But Billy Corgan is trying to resurrect the NWA. Now, for those of you that might have saw the last video, and for those of you that didn't see the last video, I grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina, which was a main NWA territory back in the day, ran by Jim Crockett Promotions. If you want to know why that eventually failed, check out some good videos called Jim Crockett Promotions, The Good Old Days. It can be bought from highspots.com or Amazon, and then check out the David Crockett Shoot interview put out by RF Video a couple of years ago at rfvideo.com. R as in Rusty, F as in Frank, video.com. But it's not my company, it's Rob Feinstein's company, rfvideo.com. Anyway, long story short, Jim Crockett Promotions was part of the territorial system. Every wrestling promoter had a certain territory in which they promoted in. For example, the WWF, which was a precursor to the WWF, which was a precursor to now the WWE, promoted throughout the northeastern part of the country originally. And then after that, it was Jim Crockett Promotions down in the South, which was North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia at the time. An occasional spot wrestling show in Ohio, maybe, and then an occasional spot show in Canada. But generally speaking, Jim Crockett Promotions and the NWA down there was North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia. And then, say, Georgia was Ole Anderson, Fred Ward, Jack and Jerry Briscoe, etc., etc. And there were different owners throughout the country, and each owner had that certain territory of their country, and the owners of each territory did not violate those boundaries until such time that Vince McMahon bought the WWF from his father, Vince McMahon Sr., who has been passed away for a number of years, and expanded and basically took over most of the country. The only person that was left in major opposition to Vince McMahon and what was then the WWF at that time in the 80s was the Jim Crockett Promotions NWA. And so I'm just going to stick to that. We'll talk about Vince McMahon's expansion throughout the country, maybe in a later video, and I might do it here. I don't know. When I do these things, I prefer to talk just from the heart. I don't have any written notes. I don't have any major TV production or video equipment. All I have is the camera that's on my computer. That's why you might see in the background the background of one of my bedrooms where my computer is. But anyway, back to the wrestling part. Some of you might know of what was referred to as Black Saturday. Well, Black Saturday was when Vince McMahon in 1984 July of '84, purchased what was the Georgia television program at the time, World Championship Wrestling, on WTBS, now just TBS, but back then it was WTBS, and put his brand of wrestling, the WWF, on there. Well, as you can imagine, they were flooded with a lot of calls at WTBS as to where was Gordon Solie, the greatest wrestling announcer in the history of the business, and at the time. And for you guys, even Jim Ross will say that Gordon Solie was the best wrestling announcer in the business. So just letting you know that. But anyway, long story short. So eventually, after about a 3-month contract, Ted Turner, the owner of WTBS, and Vince McMahon had a falling out because Vince McMahon was just basically producing his television show throughout the Northeast and was sending clips of wrestling matches down to WTBS to be aired on the 6:05 Saturday night program. And prior to that, when it was owned by the NWA, they actually had studio matches that were taped in front of a live audience and live taped interviews and things of that nature. So, and the NWA was always built on credibility, tradition, respect, and treating the industry as a sport, even though even back then it was not a sport, it was entertainment. Their thought process was, if you treat it like a sport and treat it legitimately, then more people will come to the shows and more people will buy tickets and then later buy pay-per-view, etc., etc. And that's why I fell in love with wrestling as a whole. Sure, I watched the WWF, and I knew about Hulk Hogan and all those guys and the Rock and Wrestling Connection and all of that most of you have heard about. But for me, I tend to gravitate more toward the realistic product of good versus evil, and I'm going to kick your ass, and this other guy's going to kick the other guy's ass, and they come to a confrontation, and they beat each other. And in later videos, I'll talk about some matches. But what I'm getting at is the NWA product was treated as more realistic, to whereas the WWF product was treated more entertainment or more glitz and glamour and singing and dancing and cartoons and soap opera, which has now come back to bite them in the ass in 2017 because WWF's ratings are down. Everything is down except for a few numbers on the WWE network. They're up, but beyond that everything else is down. Their live event attendance is down and so forth. So that's why when you see other videos online about the dire straits or dire needs of the WWE, that's what a lot of people are talking about how everything's going downhill for the WWE, and they don't know how or when it will turn around. Purposely, I wouldn't shed a tear if the WWE went out of business. That way, somebody, I know that's going to cause heat with some of you. And today, by the way, I forgot this part, is December 4th, 2017. So as of December 4th, 2017, here's what we've got. But let me get back to the other issue, in that what eventually happened is Jim Crockett Promotions and the Crockett family, which was originally Big Jim Crockett Sr., the father, who passed away on April 1st, 1973. But in the 80s, when the Crockett's started to expand the NWA, it was Jim Crockett Jr., David Crockett, Jackie Crockett, and Jackie and David were friends of mine, especially Jackie, that I'll talk about in later videos. And Francis Crockett and the mother that's now passed away, Miss Elizabeth Crockett. But Jimmy, David, and Jackie ran the company, and Francis ran the minor league baseball team that they owned at the time, called the Charlotte O's, which played in Double-A baseball at the time, and Jim Crockett Memorial Park. But anyway, so Ted Turner and Vince had a falling out. Ted Turner knew Jimmy Crockett from previous engagements years before Crockett ever took over the time slot on WTBS. So Turner called Crockett. Crockett called Vince. They had a meeting. Vince said he wanted $1 million for the TV contract. Crockett paid McMahon the $1 million. There's speculation that without that $1 million, Vince McMahon would not have been able to finance WrestleMania, the first one, that is WrestleMania #1. I think that's true. I've never known anybody to deny that fact. But in any case, on with the story. So essentially, Jim Crockett got the 6:05 to 8:05 time slot. And prior to this, I'm sorry to be jumping around, but prior to this, Ted Turner had promised Cowboy Bill Watts of Mid-South Wrestling the time slot, but eventually sold that to Jimmy Crockett after Crockett paid McMahon for the time slot, and then Ted Turner, trying to make up to Bill Watts, gave Bill Watts a Sunday afternoon time slot on WTBS. So essentially you had NWA, Jim Crockett Promotions, on 6:05 to 8:05, except for times when they had Braves baseball and different things on. But generally it was 6:05 to 8:05 p.m. on Saturdays Eastern Time. And then you had Bill Watts on Sundays. I think it was 5:30 to 6:30 or 5:05 to 6:05 with his Mid-South Wrestling. In all this, while all this was going on, Ole Anderson decided to sue Jack and Jerry Briscoe, his partners, and others. Fred Ward, I think, was involved in that as well. Jim Barnett. I'm not sure if Fred Ward was alive then or not. Forgive me, but so scratch that. But I know that Jim Barnett was involved in some of it. And Ole Anderson lost the case. Ole said that he had a contract that was supposed to allow for, if Jack and Jerry and Jim Barnett wanted to sell to anyone, that they had to sell to, they had to give Ole Anderson the first right of refusal to buy their rights for Georgia Championship Wrestling. That didn't happen. As I said, they sold their shares directly to Vince McMahon Jr., which you guys know as Mr. McMahon from today's wrestling. And thus is what created the Black Saturday controversy in the first place. You can also read Ole Anderson's book. I forget the title of it, but you can Google it and find out what the title of it is. And that'll tell you a lot about it as well. But I would encourage you to check out those two videos. One of them called Jim Crockett Promotions, The Good Old Days, and the other one called The David Crockett Shoot Interview. The Jim Crockett Promotions, The Good Old Days, is by High Spots. The David Crockett Shoot Interview is by RF Video. And I'm sure there's some other videos around as well. And there's another one called Mid-Atlantic Memories, which you can buy at NWALegends.com from Greg Price. Although, you know, Greg Price is not always honest. So I would encourage you maybe to make sure that you get your video if you do order from Greg Price. Or you can order it from Amazon. You know, Amazon's legit and they'll send you your stuff. But what I'm getting at in saying all this is, so that's what led to the WWF and NWA competing And through most of the 80s, the WWF was winning because obviously the core territory for the WWF was in the Northeast and Madison Square Garden in New York and different bigger buildings like that. And McMahon would go around to different television stations and pay a lot of money to buy time slots from Jim Crockett. I mean, not from Jim Crockett Promotions, but out from under Jim Crockett Promotions is how I should say that, and get his product on the air. And that's why the WWF is more well known for the most part, and things of that nature. And then the Crockett's started buying up everything that McMahon didn't have. Like the Crockett's bought out, as I said, they paid McMahon $1 million to buy the Georgia time slot. So they then had North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, and based on that WTBS time slot, they went all over the country in promoting matches, in the United States at least. And some say that was the downfall of Jim Crockett Promotions, and others say it was a necessity. But no matter which way you fall on that part of it, there started the war between the Crockett's and Vince McMahon. In short, for those of you that have read and seen videos about the dying days of WCW, I find it rather odd that Vince McMahon is complaining about Ted Turner doing tactics to him when Ted Turner years later bought the NWA / Jim Crockett Promotions from the Crockett family and turned it into WCW. I'll get back to that in a minute. And started having WCW Monday Nitro. Then Vince McMahon then had Ted Turner competing with him directly. And Vince was hollering, foul, foul, he shouldn't have did this, he shouldn't have did that. But in essence, Ted Turner and Eric Bischoff did the same thing to Vince McMahon that Vince McMahon had done to Jim Crockett Promotions years earlier. It's just the difference was Ted Turner had deeper pockets than Jimmy Crockett did. That's the bottom line. And that's why WCW won the ratings war for 2 years and almost bankrupted WWE. But that's another video for a later date. Back to the NWA thing. So when the Crockett's expanded to another territory, they bought out the Florida territory from Mike Graham and whoever else was in that cluster of owners. And so those wrestlers came with the Crockett's. But I saw a video earlier today online where, in regards to the David Crockett shoot interview by RF Video, where David Crockett says the downfall for Jim Crockett Promotions didn't come from the Florida acquisition. And they also bought out Kansas City from Bob Geigel, and then later sold it back to Bob Geigel, but by then the territory was dead and so forth. But that's inconsequential. It was dead when the Crockett's had it out in Kansas City. But back to the Florida thing. What really started the downfall of Jim Crockett Promotions was the purchase of Mid-South Wrestling. At this point, Bill Watts had expanded his Mid-South promotion to try to compete with Vince McMahon and Jim Crockett, and changed the name to the Universal Wrestling Federation, or UWF. And so some say Bill Watts had financial problems because of the oil crisis in his core markets of Oklahoma, parts of Texas, and Louisiana. Others say Bill Watts had problems in his marriage. Others say a combination of both. But the bottom line is, eventually Bill Watts sold to Jim Crockett. That was good on the surface because it gave Crockett more television stations to compete with Vince McMahon, and then put Crockett in syndicated television of 170 to 180 television stations across the country, not just the WTBS show that I talked about earlier. So that was good from Crockett from that standpoint. What was bad from Crockett, or bad for Crockett rather, was, I'm still nervous. This is only my second video. People, please forgive me. But what was bad for Jim Crockett was that he did not do his due diligence. And if you guys get the RF video David Crockett shoot interview, David Crockett will say the same thing too. Jimmy Crockett did not do his due diligence and discover that when they bought Mid-South Wrestling / UWF, negotiated by Jim Ross, because Jim Ross was in the office of the UWF at that time, that Jimmy Crockett did not do his due diligence, and Bill Watts was in a lot of debt. And so when the Crockett's bought the UWF company, instead of saying we'll buy the company, but we're not buying the debt, or not buy the company at all, and then just let the talent come to Jim Crockett Promotions once that company, Mid-South, would have went out of business. They bought the company, but bought the debt, and I think it was like $33,000 a week that Jim Crockett Promotions had to, or was supposed to pay to Bill Watts for the promotion. Bill Watts only got part of that money. He never got the rest of it, because the Crockett's went out of business due to financial problems and various things of that nature. The Crockett's booker in the 80s, because you got to remember, in the 70s and 80s and even prior to that, there was always an owner of a territory and usually a booker and maybe an assistant booker. There were no writers, and no Hollywood writers from Conan O'Brien like WWE has now and all that crap. It was a booker, an assistant booker, and an owner. And Dusty Rhodes, the late Dusty Rhodes, real name Virgil Runnels Jr., was the booker. And the problem was Dusty was also an active wrestler at the time. So as good as Dusty was as a wrestler, I think he was juggling many hats in terms of being the booker of the territory plus being a wrestler. And I just think that he got in over his head creatively, and he had Jimmy Crockett's ear, and he got Jimmy Crockett to spend a lot of money, which is also on the RF video David Crockett shoot interview, as well as the other video that I said in this video that you need to see, the Jim Crockett Promotions Good Old Days video from High Spots. Dusty got Jimmy Crockett to spend a lot of money. Jimmy Crockett, on the other hand, still had a small staff in his office from back when Jim Crockett Promotions started out as Mid-Atlantic Wrestling, just doing North Carolina, South Carolina, and Virginia, instead of the nationwide expansion. So I think all of that combined was the catalyst to make Jim Crockett Promotions go out of business. Before they went out of business, they were having trouble meeting payroll, much like TNA does today in 2017, and various things of that nature. David Crockett said on the video he didn't want to sell. My friend Jackie Crockett said he didn't want to sell. But in reality, if they had not sold, it was possibly going to be the end of Jim Crockett Promotions, as well as the end of their mother's retirement. And the mother was in her 80s at the time, so obviously she couldn't go out and work a job and make a living. So it was best to sell, and that's what they did. They sold it to Ted Turner. Ted Turner still kept the rights to he was a member of the NWA for, I think, a year or two after that. And then somehow, which we won't get into, the board of directors of this new version of the NWA in the 90s at that point said that Ted Turner did not pay rights. I think this was around 91, 92, somewhere in that neighborhood. 92, I think it was where he needed to pay rights to be a member of the NWA. Ted Turner didn't want to pay that money. So then he already had the rights to the World Championship Wrestling name simply because that was the name of the Georgia television program, World Championship Wrestling, long before World Championship Wrestling was a promotion, if that makes sense. So he just changed the whole promotion to World Championship Wrestling, and that's how it became World Championship Wrestling, also known as WCW. Ted Turner hired a host of people, as you know, that ran the company in the ground. In 2001, Ted Turner merged with AOL Time Warner. They didn't want wrestling on their television stations. And in the last years, it's been documented that Ted Turner, well, not Ted Turner per se, because he was out of power at the time, but AOL Time Warner had lost between $60 to $80 million. I'm not sure. It could be more, it could be less, but losing that kind of money for a major corporation is not a good thing. So they sold to WWF at the time and Vince McMahon. And Vince McMahon tried the WCW relaunch, and that didn't work for various reasons. And that's what led the WWE to be still today the number one competitor, because of mistakes made by Jim Crockett Promotions, and then additional mistakes made by Ted Turner and WCW, and then by AOL after the merger between AOL and Turner Broadcasting. So I don't like to hear when people say Vince McMahon did this and Vince McMahon did that. Yes, Vince McMahon did a lot for the wrestling business, and you can't take that away from him. But the thing I think that gets lost here is, quite frankly, it's not just what Vince McMahon did to build his company into the number one wrestling powerhouse. What gets lost here is the mistakes over and over made by NWA, which was Jim Crockett Promotions at the time, and then later WCW, which was Ted Turner originally, and then later by AOL Time Warner hiring Eric Bischoff and all that fiasco that all of you have heard many times. But it's a combination of all of that. It's not just what Vince McMahon did. If you own a company and you make mistakes yourself, and your competitor capitalizes on those mistakes, it doesn't necessarily mean that your competitor was better than you. It just means that you made mistakes that opened the door for your competitor to take advantage of those. So while I will agree that Vince McMahon did do a lot to help and to also hurt the wrestling business, it was the mistakes by the other people that I just mentioned in this video that also helped Vince McMahon to become the number one powerhouse. So once Ted Turner sold out to WWE, and even years before that, the NWA name had been just a bunch of independent promoters with no television. So even though they were around, most people didn't know the NWA name was still around. It was like just a bunch of independent promoters trying to be the NWA, if that makes sense. With no television, no name recognition talent, no production values. Basically a bunch of independent guys who I complained about in episode 1, who buy a ring on the internet or other places that they get them from, and put up a couple of banners, put up a couple of posters, put something on Facebook, say, yay, I've got a promotion and that type of thing. So now I'm a wrestling promoter. Sorry about the phone. Big deal. You become a wrestling promoter when you have television. Everybody listen up. If you have a promotion and you do not have television for that promotion, don't waste your money. Let me get up here close to the camera. Don't waste your money. Please save your money. Nobody's going to come see your product without television. That's the bottom line. And I'm sorry to hurt anybody's feelings. I'm not trying to be rude. I'm just being honest. Having said that, back to the original point, the fact of the matter is that yes, Vince McMahon did a lot of good and he's done a lot of bad. But he also knew how to capitalize on the mistakes made by the other people that I said in this video. The Crockett's, Ted Turner, AOL Time Warner, Eric Bischoff, the wrestlers under the Eric Bischoff regime that didn't want to do jobs to help other people, etc., etc. The outrageous contracts, etc., etc. So as we move this along, when the NWA name became just a bunch of independent promoters with no television, everybody thought it was dead, because in actuality it was dead, but in reality it was still around technically. So the NWA has been around for all these years, but unless you live in an NWA market and you go to these high school gyms and stuff, you would have never known the NWA was still around. So as of this past October, Bruce Tharpe, the owner and president of the NWA, began in negotiations with Billy Corgan to buy the NWA. And most of you know about Billy Corgan's problems with TNA, Global Force Wrestling, Dixie Carter. I mean, Dixie Carter was a nice, good-looking lady, but a horrible businesswoman, and all of that. So, long story short, Billy Corgan bought the NWA, enlisted the help of his friend Dave Lagana, who used to work for Ring of Honor and WWE, and so he knows what he's talking about. So Billy Corgan is already surrounding himself with people that can make the new version of the NWA a top-notch promotion. As you may know from other videos on YouTube and other places, Billy Corgan let those relationships lapse with those independent groups so that Billy Corgan could operate the NWA only under his vision and nobody else's vision. So Billy Corgan and Dave Lagana have already started promoting the NWA brand. They have a YouTube channel. It's NWA Wrestling, or excuse me, youtube.com/NWA Wrestling. Or you can just go to YouTube, in the search bar on YouTube, put in NWA Wrestling, and it'll take you right to their YouTube channel. Click on that, and it'll show you the videos that they've been putting out. They've been putting out some good videos. Their NWA champion is Tim Storm, who is a real-life middle school teacher for right now, because Billy Corgan shows will not start until the spring of this year, 2018. So until then, Billy Corgan and Dave Lagana have just been promoting the NWA and the NWA Championship and Tim Storm and everything associated with that on their YouTube channel, while they're having the NWA champion Tim Storm go around to different independent promotions and wrestle different challengers like Joe Cephas and Nick Aldis, who was Magnus in TNA, and various things. So they're building the brand slowly. And Billy Corgan has a 20-year plan for how he wants the NWA to go. So while you may not have heard of this, and for some of you, you may have heard of it already by the time you see this video, give it a chance. The old saying, Rome wasn't built in a day. Any company has to start off small before they can get big. Even Vince McMahon was a small company at one point, and Vince McMahon even went bankrupt a few times before making it big. So before you start pissing on Billy Corgan and saying this ain't nothing and all that, give Billy Corgan and Dave Lagana a chance. I've wrote Tim Storm, told him I'd volunteer to help Billy Corgan, and Dave Lagana, of course, they didn't write back. I don't know if that means they just don't have anything right now for me, or if they just think, well, he's mainly a fan, we don't know who he is, so we're not writing back. But whether they write back or not, I will support the NWA. The NWA Championship has legacy back to 1905 when it was the National Wrestling Association. Then in 1948, it became the National Wrestling Alliance. So the Dome Globe Championship is amazing. It has lineage back to the old NWA as well as the new NWA, as well as WCW. And even the NWA title was defended on WWF shows back in the day when Vince McMahon Sr. owned it. So before Vince McMahon Sr. sold the company to Vince McMahon Jr. and then passed away. So the NWA title has a legacy. It's tradition. That's not just a slogan. It's history, tradition, legacy. And the NWA was built on old school wrestling and putting the emphasis on the athletic contest and not on walking to the ring for 5 minutes and then getting in the ring talking for another 20 minutes before you have a 5-minute match and somebody is the champion. No, that's not how that works. The NWA is going to treat the business with respect. You guys can look on their YouTube channel and you see an interview with the Busted Open radio show on Sirius XM, where they talk about bringing back old school. And the term old school doesn't mean you have to go back to 1950 or 60s wrestling. What it means is just treating the business with respect and some importance, and not talking for 20 minutes and having a 5-minute match, or not having somebody's breast in somebody's face and comedy skits and really bad soap opera like WWE. So I support the NWA, and I suggest you should too. Check out their YouTube channel. Email me rusty.loudermilk@yahoo.com with your comments, positively or negatively, on this video or any video. Give me ideas for future topics to talk about. Yes, I'll be reporting on House of Hardcore in the near future. Yes, I'll be reporting on NWA in the near future. Go NWA, go Billy Corgan, even if you guys don't hire me. And lastly, as a current and old school fan, I've got to cut my promo in case Billy Corgan and Dave Lagana will ever let me work for the NWA. As a matter of fact, let me beg here. I would love to work for the NWA at some point. At my home in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, I could do stuff out of my home office. I could go to the shows if they have them in the Pittsburgh area. I would volunteer until such time the NWA got off the ground where they could pay me, just because I believe in the NWA and I'm a wrestling fan. I'm not a sports entertainment fan. Okay, I am a pro wrestling fan, and you should too. So email me rusty.loudermilk@yahoo.com. I'll spell that for you. It's rusty.loudermilk@yahoo.com. Loudermilk is like speak louder and give me milk. Loudermilk. rusty.loudermilk@yahoo.com. Email me with anything. But I said I was going to cut my promo, so here goes. Just in case they want to use me as a heel manager. If they don't, then here's a promo which will lighten things up a little bit. Just for you guys' fun. Billy and Dave, if you guys see this, please understand that I don't have to be a heel manager. I'll do anything, but in no way am I making fun of the NWA, because the NWA is tradition, history, and respect, and I just love to be part of it, and I'm only having some fun with the rest of the audience in case you guys like my promo. Here goes. 3, 2, 1. Well, you know, I see here on YouTube this Tim Storm guy. And yeah, he's 53 years old. And he looks good. He's tanned. He's Mr. School Teacher, teaching the values of America to young children. Well, that's good. But you know what, Tim Storm? My name is Rusty James, and I'm president of Chaos Communications Incorporated. And my men want to come to the NWA to challenge you for the NWA World's Heavyweight Championship, or for those of us that are old school fans, because you got to be a fan before you can be in the business. Otherwise, you're nothing but a sports entertainer like old Vinnie Mac and others that have destroyed the business. But anyway, I digress. So my men want to come and challenge you, Tim Storm, for the NWA World's Heavyweight Championship, or the 10 pounds of gold. Because when Rusty Loudermilk was sitting in Charlotte, North Carolina, long before he became Rusty James, he watched the NWA, and Ric Flair, Dusty Rhodes, Ricky Steamboat, Harley Race, all of those legends. And Tim Storm, let me get right up here close to my camera and tell you, you, sir, are no Harley Race. You are no Ricky Steamboat. And you, too, should you choose to accept the challenge, Tim Storm, you, too, will go down, D-O-W-N, down, to Rusty James and Chaos Communications Incorporated and my family. And even though you haven't gotten on broadcast television yet in most of the area, Tim Storm, I see the videos on Championship Wrestling from Hollywood and the YouTube channel and Facebook, and I see weakness after weakness after weakness. So I'm going to close the video for now, but I'm asking you this question, Tim Storm. Why don't you get Billy Corgan to get out from behind his guitar or his drum sets? Or why don't you have Dave Lagana call me and say, Rusty James, we're open to you bringing your men to challenge Tim Storm for the 10 pounds of gold. Because let me explain something to you people, whether it's Dave Lagana, Billy Corgan, Tim Storm, or anybody watching this YouTube video right now. Rusty James, a 48-year-old man who has been around the wrestling business for 45 years, since the age of 3, can not only cut the greatest promo in the history of the wrestling business, but Rusty James understands the wrestling business. So my final comment to you, Tim Storm, is it's time for you to grow a pair and accept my challenge for my men. And Billy Corgan, Mr. Smashing Pumpkins, lead man Billy Corgan, calling yourself a wrestling fan. Well, if you're a wrestling fan there, Billy Corgan, how come you got tied up with Dixie Carter? That's another story for another day. But long story short, Billy Corgan, I challenge you to bring me to the NWA. And if you believe in your man, Tim Storm, then bring me to the NWA, and I'll bring my people. And at the end of the day, it may not be tomorrow, it may not be next month, it may not be 6 months, but somewhere down the road, Rusty James and my men will capture the 10 pounds of gold. And this ain't no sports entertainment program, because I'm not a sports entertainer. I'm a fan of pro wrestling, and one of the greatest pro wrestling managers in the history of the wrestling business from the Carolina Wrestling Federation in 2001 and other entities, and now I want to bring my talents to the NWA. So I say again, Tim Storm, Billy Corgan, Dave Lagana, or anybody else, accept my challenge if you dare.